A family dog howled at the attic for days, and when firefighters finally investigated, they made a heartbreaking discovery that would change everything. The Morrisons had no idea what was happening above their heads. But their golden retriever, Max, knew something they didn't. What started as an annoying disturbance would soon turn into a race against time, revealing a truth that would haunt everyone involved. In the next few minutes, you'll discover why Max's howling was the only thing standing between his family and an unimaginable tragedy. It was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday morning in the Morrison household. The sun was streaming through the kitchen windows, casting warm light across the breakfast table where Sarah Morrison sat with her coffee, watching her two kids, Emma and David, argue playfully over the last pancake. Her husband, Thomas, was scrolling through his phone, half listening to the banter. Max, their 3-year-old golden retriever, was lounging on his bed in the corner, occasionally lifting his head to watch the family he loved more than anything in the world. Life was perfect, predictable, safe. But then it happened. A sound pierced through the morning, not a bark, not a whimper, but a howl. Deep, primal, the kind of sound that makes your spine straighten and your breath catch. Max's entire body went rigid. His ears perked up. And then he did something he'd never done before in his 3 years with the family. He bolted toward the hallway, toward the attic access panel in the ceiling, and he howled again. Not a normal dog sound. This was different. Sarah set down her coffee cup slowly. Did Max just... Thomas looked up from his phone, his relaxed expression shifting. That didn't sound like Max. Emma, their 10-year-old, felt a chill run down her spine. She'd grown up with Max since she was 7, and she knew every sound he made. This wasn't it. This was something raw, something desperate. Max paced back and forth beneath the attic access, his golden fur bristling, his tail no longer wagging. He'd tilt his head back and howl that same bone-chilling sound over and over. Then he'd jump, his front paws reaching toward the ceiling as if he could claw his way through the drywall. "Max, what's wrong?" David, their 8-year-old, asked, his playful tone evaporating instantly. But Max didn't answer. He just kept howling. Sarah stood up, her maternal instinct kicking in. "Thomas, go check the attic. Maybe there's a raccoon or something." Thomas nodded, setting his phone down. He grabbed the wooden ladder they kept in the garage and positioned it beneath the attic access. As he climbed up and pushed open the panel, dust particles danced in the shaft of light. He peered inside, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. Nothing. "There's nothing up here," he called down. "Just boxes, insulation, the usual stuff." But Max knew better. The moment Thomas closed the panel, Max's howling intensified. It wasn't angry. It wasn't territorial. It was pleading. It was the sound of a creature trying desperately to communicate something critical, something urgent, something that his human family was completely missing. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. In all their years with Max, she'd never seen him like this. He was the sweetest, most gentle dog. The kind of dog who'd let the kids pull his ears and never growl, who'd greet every visitor with a wagging tail and a gentle nudge. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't anxious about storms or fireworks. He was stable, predictable, until today. The rest of Tuesday passed in a blur of confusion. Max would calm down for maybe 30 minutes, then the howling would start again. Each time it sounded more desperate. Each time the family felt more helpless. By evening, Emma was crying, worried that something was seriously wrong with their beloved pet. David kept asking if Max was sick. Thomas and Sarah exchanged worried glances across the dinner table, barely tasting their food. That night, nobody slept well. Max's howling echoed through the house at irregular intervals, sometimes at 2 a.m., sometimes at 4:30 a.m. It was as if he couldn't rest, as if something was keeping him awake, driving him to communicate in the only way he knew how. By Wednesday morning, the family was exhausted. Sarah had dark circles under her eyes. Thomas had called in sick to work. Emma was pale and quiet, her usual cheerfulness replaced by worry. Even David, who usually bounced out of bed with endless energy, moved slowly through the house like a ghost. And Max? Max was relentless. He barely touched his food. He barely drank water. His entire focus was on that attic access panel. Howl, pace, jump, howl. It was like watching someone desperately trying to warn you about danger you couldn't see. But what the Morrisons didn't know was that Max wasn't just making noise. He was the only thing standing between them and a catastrophe they couldn't even imagine. By Wednesday afternoon, the Morrisons had exhausted their list of logical explanations. Sarah had called their veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Chen, in a state of near panic. "He's been howling at the attic for over 24 hours, Sarah explained, her voice trembling slightly. "He won't eat. He won't play. He just keeps howling and jumping at the ceiling. Is he sick? Is he in pain?" Dr. Chen had asked a series of questions. Any changes in behavior, diet, recent trauma, signs of illness. Sarah answered each one with a no. Max had received his vaccinations on schedule. He'd never had any health issues. There had been no recent changes to the household. Nothing. "Bring him in tomorrow morning," Dr. Chen said. "We'll do a full examination. It could be anxiety, or he might be sensing something we can't detect. But let's rule out any medical issues first." That night, Sarah lay in bed, listening to Max's howls echoing through the house. Thomas was beside her, equally awake, both of them staring at the ceiling in the darkness. "What if it's something serious?" Sarah whispered. "The vet will figure it out," Thomas replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray. Sarah packed Max into the car, and he seemed almost relieved to be going somewhere, anywhere, away from the house. But his anxiety was palpable. He paced in the back seat, whining softly, his usual calm demeanor completely shattered. The veterinary clinic was clean and bright, filled with the smell of antiseptic and the soft sounds of other animals. Dr. Chen, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and steady hands, brought Max into the examination room while Sarah waited anxiously in the lobby. 30 minutes later, Dr. Chen emerged, Max trailing behind her, looking exhausted. "Physically, Max is perfectly healthy," Dr. Chen said, reviewing her notes. "Heart rate is normal. Temperature is normal. No signs of infection, no parasites, no ear infections, no dental issues. His blood work came back clean. Neurologically, he's responding normally to stimuli. But he's clearly distressed," Sarah said, her frustration mounting. "Something is wrong." "I agree," Dr. Chen nodded. "But it's not a medical issue. What Max is experiencing sounds more like acute anxiety or distress triggered by something environmental. Has anything changed in your home? New neighbors? Construction nearby? Any unusual smells or sounds?" Sarah shook her head slowly. "Nothing that I can think of." "Sometimes dogs can sense things we can't," Dr. Chen continued. "They have hearing ranges far beyond ours. They can detect ultrasonic frequencies, vibrations, even changes in air pressure. It's possible Max is reacting to something in your environment that's completely imperceptible to humans." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something in the attic. "I'd recommend keeping him calm, maybe using a calming supplement or pheromone diffuser. If it continues, we can discuss anti-anxiety medication. But I'd also suggest having someone inspect your home, your attic, your walls, your foundation. Sometimes animals react to pest infestations or structural issues that we don't notice. Sarah paid the bill and drove home in silence, Max resting his head against the window, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. When she arrived home, Thomas was waiting on the porch. She filled him in on the vet's assessment, and within an hour, they'd called a pest control company. The inspector arrived that afternoon, a middle-aged man named Rick with a clipboard and a flashlight. He climbed into the attic. He searched the walls. He checked the foundation. He looked everywhere. No signs of rodents, he reported. No droppings, no nesting material, no damage. Your attic is clean. Your walls are intact. Whatever your dog is sensing, it's not a pest infestation. Thomas and Sarah exchanged defeated looks. They thanked Rick and watched him drive away, feeling no closer to answers than they had been 48 hours ago. That night, Max's howling resumed with even greater intensity. It was as if the visit to the vet, the inspection, the family's attempts to help, none of it mattered. Max knew something was wrong, and he was growing more desperate to make them understand. By Friday morning, the Morrisons were running on fumes. Sarah had barely slept. Thomas had taken another day off work. Emma was missing school. Sarah couldn't bear to send her away, while Max was in such distress. David had stopped asking questions and simply clung to Max, as if his presence alone could comfort the dog. The howling was now constant. Not all day, but frequent enough that the family couldn't settle into any routine. Sarah found herself jumping at every sound, her nerves frayed to their breaking point. Thomas paced the house like a caged animal. Emma cried quietly in her room. Even David's usual resilience was cracking. "We have to do something," Sarah said to Thomas on Friday afternoon, her voice hollow with desperation. "We can't keep living like this. Max can't keep living like this." Thomas ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and helplessness. "But what?" "The vet says he's fine. The pest control guy says there's nothing in the house. We've searched the attic ourselves. What else can we do?" Sarah didn't have an answer. But she knew one thing. They were running out of time. Max's desperation was escalating. His physical condition was deteriorating. He'd barely eaten in 3 days. His coat, usually glossy and vibrant, was starting to look dull. His eyes, usually bright and warm, were becoming hollow and haunted. As if sensing the family's mounting panic, Max let out a howl that was different from all the others. Longer, more anguished, more final. It was the sound of a creature who was running out of ways to communicate, running out of strength, running out of time. And somewhere in the walls of the Morrison home, something, or someone, was running out of time too. It was Friday evening when Sarah made the decision that would change everything. She was sitting at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in front of her, watching Max through the window as he paced back and forth on the back porch. He'd stopped howling an hour ago, which somehow felt worse than the constant noise. The silence was heavier, more ominous. It felt like surrender. The past 3 days had been a blur of desperation and confusion. Sarah had barely slept, her mind cycling through endless possibilities and fears. She'd replayed every moment of the past week, searching for clues she might have missed, signs she should have recognized. But there was nothing. Just the inexplicable terror of a dog she loved, more than almost anything in the world. Experiencing something she couldn't understand or help him through. Thomas was upstairs putting David to bed, reading him the same bedtime story he'd been reading all week. A tale of adventure and safety that felt almost cruel in its irony. Emma was in her room, headphones on, trying to block out the tension that had consumed their home like a living, breathing entity. The house felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in, like the very air had become thick and difficult to breathe. Even the familiar creaks and groans of the old Victorian home seemed ominous now, laden with hidden meaning. The house felt suffocating, like the very air had become thick and difficult to breathe. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She'd already called the vet. Dr. Patricia Chen had been kind but ultimately unhelpful, offering only theories and suggestions. She'd already called pest control. Rick, the inspector, had been thorough but had found nothing. No droppings, no nesting material, no signs of life. She'd already called a structural engineer named Michael Torres, who'd spent 2 hours inspecting the foundation, the walls, the roof. He'd found nothing. She'd even called her neighbor Janet, a retired nurse, who'd suggested everything from allergies to early-onset canine dementia. But there was one person she hadn't called yet. Someone she'd been avoiding because it seemed ridiculous, paranoid. The kind of thing that would make Thomas raise his eyebrows and gently suggest that maybe she was the one experiencing anxiety, not Max. But what else was there to do? She found the number for the local fire department's non-emergency line and dialed before she could talk herself out of it. Her finger hovered over the screen for a moment, and she could almost hear Thomas's voice. "Sarah, we've already had professionals look at everything. What are you going to tell them? That our dog is possessed?" But she pressed call anyway. "Fire department, how can I help you?" A calm, professional voice answered. It was a woman, her tone neutral and patient. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts into something that wouldn't sound completely insane. "Hi, this is probably going to sound crazy, but my dog has been obsessively howling at my attic for 3 days. We've had a vet check him. He's perfectly healthy. We've had a pest control inspection. Nothing there. We've had a structural engineer look at the house. Everything's fine. But he won't stop. He won't eat. He barely drinks water. And I'm wondering if... I don't know. If maybe there's something you could check? Some kind of gas leak or carbon monoxide or something that we can't detect but the dog can sense?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sarah could hear the faint sound of a radio in the background, the dispatcher's fingers typing on a keyboard. "Ma'am, what's your address?" the dispatcher asked, her tone shifting from casual to professional. There was an urgency there now, a subtle shift that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Sarah gave her the address and phone number, her voice wavering slightly. The dispatcher asked a series of quick questions, her pen moving rapidly across a notepad Sarah couldn't see. "Was anyone in the home experiencing symptoms like dizziness, nausea, or headaches? Had there been any recent work done on the home's heating system? Did the dog have access to any specific area of the house where he was most distressed? Any recent changes to the home's ventilation?" "Just the attic," Sarah answered to the last question. "He's completely fixated on the attic access panel. That's where he goes, that's where he howls, that's where he tries to jump to." "How long has the dog been exhibiting this behavior?" the dispatcher asked. "Since Tuesday morning. 3 days. It's gotten worse, not better. He was howling constantly yesterday, and today he's just exhausted, defeated, like he's given up trying to tell us something." There was another pause. Sarah could almost hear the dispatcher's mind working, connecting dots, considering possibilities. "We're going to send a unit out to your location." the dispatcher said finally, her voice carrying a new weight. They should be there in about 10 minutes. Just to be safe, I'd recommend opening some windows and getting everyone outside while they're here. Can you do that? Sarah's heart began to race, a mixture of hope and terror flooding through her. Is it serious? We don't know yet, the dispatcher replied, her voice calm but firm. But better safe than sorry. Get your family outside, okay? And keep your dog with you. Sarah hung up and immediately called upstairs, her voice louder than she intended. Thomas, we need to get the kids outside, now! Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs, confusion written across his face. He was still wearing his work clothes, a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, khaki pants. His hair was slightly mussed from running his hands through it all day, a nervous habit she'd noticed him developing over the past few days. What? Why? What happened? He asked, descending the stairs quickly. The fire department is coming. I called them about Max. They said we should get outside while they check the house. They think it might be carbon monoxide. For a moment, Thomas just stared at her, his expression cycling through confusion, concern, and then understanding. Then he nodded and moved into action without another word. That was one of the things Sarah loved about her husband, his ability to trust her instincts, to move forward even when he didn't fully understand. He went to Emma's room and knocked on her door. Em, we need to go outside. Now, grab a jacket. Within 5 minutes, the entire Morrison family, plus Max, who seemed to sense that something significant was happening, were standing in the front yard, wrapped in jackets against the cool evening air. The temperature had dropped as the sun descended, and Sarah could see her breath forming small clouds in front of her face. Emma stood close to her mother, her eyes wide with worry. David, sensing the tension despite his young age, clung to his father's hand. Max stood between them, his body, language finally relaxed for the first time in 3 days. His tail hung low, not wagging, but his breathing had slowed. Whatever he'd been trying to warn them about, at least they were now outside. At least they were safe. Sarah began to explain everything to Thomas. The call to the dispatcher, the questions she'd been asked, the 10-minute timeline. Thomas listened, his arm around her waist, his jaw clenched. You did the right thing, he said quietly. Even if it turns out to be nothing, you did the right thing. The sirens arrived before Sarah had even finished her explanation. 2 fire trucks pulled up to their house, their lights painting the quiet suburban street in alternating red and blue. The sound was loud, almost violent, in the peaceful neighborhood. Sarah could see curtains twitching in nearby houses as neighbors peered out to see what was happening. Firefighters in full gear began unloading equipment from the trucks with practiced efficiency. They moved with purpose, their movements coordinated and deliberate. This wasn't a casual wellness check. This was a response to a potential hazard. The fire chief, a tall man in his early 60s named Captain Rodriguez, with kind eyes and a reassuring presence, approached the family. His uniform was pristine, his badge gleaming in the fading light. Mrs. Morrison? He asked, extending his hand. Yes. Sarah shook it, feeling a strange mixture of relief and embarrassment. Thank you for coming. I know it probably sounds silly, a dog howling at the attic. We've had professionals look at everything. Not silly at all, Captain Rodriguez interrupted, his voice warm but serious. Dogs have incredible instincts. They can detect things we can't, ultrasonic frequencies, vibrations, chemical compounds in the air. If your dog has been this distressed, there's usually a reason. Let's take a look. He turned to his team, and gave a series of instructions. 2 firefighters would check the attic. 2 would check the heating system and furnace. 1 would run a full sweep of the house with carbon monoxide detectors. Another would check the gas lines. The firefighters entered the house with their equipment: thermal imaging cameras, carbon monoxide detectors, gas detection devices, oxygen meters. They moved through the home with the familiarity of people who'd done this hundreds of times before. Sarah watched from the front yard, her arm around Emma, Thomas standing close beside her with David on his shoulders. Minutes passed, long, agonizing minutes that felt like hours. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A cool breeze swept through the neighborhood, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of a dog barking several houses down. Then Captain Rodriguez emerged from the house, and his expression had changed. It was no longer casual or reassuring. It was serious, grave, the kind of expression people wore when they were about to deliver bad news. "Mrs. Morrison, I need you to stay out here," he said quietly, walking toward her with measured steps. "Don't let anyone back inside the house. We've detected a significant carbon monoxide leak coming from your attic. It's concentrated there, but it's beginning to seep down into the main living areas through the ventilation system and the gaps around the access panel." Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The ground seemed to shift, and she gripped Thomas's arm to steady herself. "Carbon monoxide? But how? We had the heating system checked last month. Everything was fine." "The source isn't your heating system," Captain Rodriguez said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of what he was about to reveal. "There's something in your attic. We need to investigate further, but I need you and your family to stay out here. Is there somewhere you can go tonight? Family? Friends? Somewhere safe where you can stay while we work?" Thomas stepped forward, his voice steady despite the shock that was clearly rippling through him. "My brother lives 3 blocks away. We can go there. But what's in the attic? What's causing the carbon monoxide?" Captain Rodriguez exchanged a glance with one of his firefighters who'd just emerged from the house. "We're not sure yet. We've found what appears to be an old propane heater up there, the kind that shouldn't be in use in a residential attic. It's been improperly vented, and it's been leaking carbon monoxide for who knows how long. But there's something else. We found... Well, we need to investigate further before I can tell you more." "Something else?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, something else?" "Just go to your brother's house," Captain Rodriguez said gently. "We're going to need to call in additional units and possibly the police. But your family is safe now. You got out in time." As Thomas hurried the family toward his brother's house, just 3 blocks away, a journey that felt surreal and dreamlike, Sarah turned back one last time to look at their home. The Victorian house with its white picket fence and the flower garden she'd spent all summer cultivating. The place where they'd built their life, where Emma had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where David had taken his first steps across the hardwood floors, where they'd brought Max home as a puppy, a tiny ball of golden fur that fit in the palm of her hand. The fire truck's lights continued to flash against the darkening sky, painting the house in alternating colors of emergency and danger. And she understood, finally and completely, what Max had been trying to tell them all along. He hadn't been going crazy. He hadn't been anxious or disturbed by some minor irritation. He'd been warning them. His instincts had detected something lethal, something invisible, odorless, colorless, something that could have killed them all in their sleep without any of them ever knowing what was happening. Carbon monoxide was called the silent killer for a reason. It crept through homes undetected, stealing oxygen from the blood, causing confusion, then unconsciousness, then death. Max's howling had been a desperate plea, a frantic attempt to communicate the incomprehensible to his beloved humans. And it had worked. Because of a dog's love, because of his instinct to protect his family, they were alive. But as the fire truck's lights continued to flash against the darkening sky, as Captain Rodriguez began to investigate the source of the carbon monoxide more thoroughly, he was about to discover something in the Morrison attic that would raise far more questions than it's answered. Something that would transform this story from a close call with a faulty heater into something far more sinister, far more disturbing. And by the time the night was over, the Morrison family would understand that Max hadn't just saved them from carbon monoxide poisoning. He'd saved them from something much, much worse. The Morrison family arrived at Thomas's brother's house in a state of shock. Uncle Michael, Thomas's older brother, lived in a modest 2-story home with his wife, Patricia, and their teenage son, Kevin. They'd been in the middle of dinner when Thomas called from the car, his voice tense and hurried, explaining that there was a carbon monoxide leak and they needed to stay the night. Michael and Patricia had immediately cleared out the guest room and set up sleeping arrangements. Now, as Sarah sat on the edge of the guest bed, watching Emma and David drift off to sleep on either side of her, she felt a strange sense of displacement. This wasn't her home. These weren't her familiar walls. Outside, the streets looked different. The sounds were different. Even the air smelled different. Max lay on the floor beside the bed, his golden head resting on his paws. For the first time in 3 days, he was completely calm. His breathing was steady and deep. Occasionally, his eyes would open and he'd look at Sarah, as if to confirm that she was still there, that the family was still together, that the danger had passed. Downstairs, Thomas was in the living room with Michael and Patricia, watching the local news. Sarah could hear the murmur of their voices, the occasional clink of a coffee cup. She knew Thomas was probably explaining everything again, answering questions, trying to make sense of what had happened. Around 11 p.m., there was a knock on the bedroom door. Thomas poked his head in, careful not to wake the children. Captain Rodriguez called. He whispered. He wants us to come back to the house tomorrow morning. They've found something. Sarah's stomach tightened. Something? What kind of something? He didn't say over the phone, but he said it's important. He also said the police are involved now. Police. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Sarah woke before dawn, her mind already racing, her body tense with anticipation and dread. She dressed quietly, careful not to wake Emma and David, and made her way downstairs where Thomas was already waiting with a cup of coffee. They drove back to their house in silence, neither of them quite knowing what to say. The morning was overcast, the sky a uniform shade of gray that seemed to match their mood perfectly. As they turned onto their street, Sarah could see that the fire trucks were gone, but there were now 2 police cars parked in front of their house, their lights off, but their presence unmistakable. Captain Rodriguez was waiting for them on the porch. With him were 2 police officers, a woman with sharp eyes and a stern expression, and a man who looked to be in his 60s with gray streaking his dark hair. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison. Captain Rodriguez greeted them, his expression grave. Thank you for coming back. I'd like you to meet Detective Sarah Chen and Detective Robert Martinez. They're going to need to ask you some questions. Sarah's mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios. Had someone broken into their attic? Was there a squatter hiding in the walls? Had there been a crime committed in their home? "What's going on?" Thomas asked, his voice steady but his hand finding Sarah's and squeezing it tightly. "Why don't we go inside?" Detective Chen suggested, gesturing toward the front door. The interior of their home looked exactly as they'd left it. The breakfast dishes still on the counter from Friday morning, Emma's backpack by the door, David's toy truck on the living room floor. But it felt different now, violated somehow, as if the house itself had been compromised, its secrets exposed. They sat in the living room, the detectives across from them on the couch, Captain Rodriguez standing by the window. Detective Martinez pulled out a small notebook. "The propane heater we found in your attic," Detective Chen began, "is not a standard residential unit. It's a military-grade portable heater, the kind typically used in field operations or temporary installations. It's been modified poorly, with makeshift ventilation that was never properly sealed." "But that's not the main issue," Detective Martinez continued. "When we investigated the attic more thoroughly, we found something else. There's a second room up there, a hidden room that's been constructed behind the insulation and the rafters. It appears to have been there for quite some time." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "A hidden room? In their attic?" "What do you mean, a hidden room?" Thomas asked, his voice tight. "Exactly what I said," Detective Martinez replied. "Someone has constructed a concealed space in your attic. It's approximately 12 feet by 10 feet, with a makeshift door that's been covered with insulation to hide it from casual inspection. Inside, we found evidence that suggests someone has been living there. Recently." The room seemed to spin. Sarah gripped the armrest of the couch to steady herself. "Living there?" she repeated, her voice barely audible. "You mean someone has been in our attic? Living in our attic?" "We believe so," Detective Chen said. "We found bedding, empty food containers, a camping lantern, and several other items. There's also evidence of a toilet setup, a 5-gallon bucket with a seat, if you will. The propane heater was being used to heat the space during the colder months." Thomas stood up abruptly, his face flushing with anger and fear. "Are you telling me that someone has been living in my house, in my attic, while my family was sleeping downstairs?" "That appears to be the case," Detective Martinez confirmed. "We're still investigating, but based on the condition of the items we found and the wear patterns on the flooring, we believe the space has been occupied for at least several months, possibly longer." Sarah felt nausea rising in her throat. She thought of Emma and David sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that someone, a stranger, had been living just above their heads. She thought of all the times she'd heard creaks and groans in the house and attributed them to the old structure settling. How many of those sounds had been footsteps? How many had been the intruder moving around? "We need to ask you some questions," Detective Chen said gently. "Have you noticed anything unusual? Strange sounds? Items missing or moved? Any indication that someone had been in your home?" Sarah and Thomas exchanged glances. The creaks, the occasional sounds that they dismissed. The time David had asked about the person in the ceiling, and they'd laughed it off as his imagination. "There were sounds," Sarah said slowly. "We thought it was just the house settling. It's an old Victorian, and old houses make noise." "And Max," Thomas added, understanding dawning on his face. Max wasn't reacting to carbon monoxide. He was reacting to the person living in the attic. He could sense them, hear them. "That's very likely," Captain Rodriguez interjected. "Dogs have incredible hearing and a strong sense of smell. If someone was living in your attic, Max would have been aware of their presence long before you would have been." Detective Martinez flipped through his notebook. We found something else in the hidden room that we need to discuss with you. There was a journal. Handwritten entries dating back approximately 8 months. We've only begun to review the contents. But what we've found so far is concerning. Concerning how? Sarah asked, dreading the answer. The writer appears to have been obsessed with your family, Detective Chen said carefully. Specifically, with your children. The world stopped. Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The implications of those words crashed over her like a wave, threatening to pull her under. What do you mean, obsessed with our children? Thomas's voice had become dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded an explosion. The journal contains observations, Detective Martinez explained, his voice clinical and detached. Times when the children were home, what they were doing, what they were wearing. Descriptions of their routines, their schedules, their habits. There are also sketches, drawings of your house, the attic space, the access points. Sarah felt Thomas's hand grip hers so tightly it hurt, but she didn't pull away. She needed the anchor of his touch, needed to know that he was real, that this was real, that this nightmare was actually happening. Do you know who it was? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Do you know who was living in our attic? Not yet, Detective Chen replied. We're running prints from items we found in the space. We're also checking the journal against missing persons reports and criminal databases. But we need your help. We need you to think about whether you've noticed anyone suspicious in your neighborhood. Anyone who seemed to take an unusual interest in your home or your family. Anyone who might have had access to your property. The questions continued for another hour. Detective Martinez asked about contractors who'd worked on the house, about visitors, about anyone who'd shown unusual interest in the family. Sarah and Thomas answered as best they could, but their minds were reeling. Finally, the detective stood to leave. We're going to need to keep your attic sealed off as a crime scene for now, Detective Chen said. You'll be able to access the rest of your house, but the attic is off limits. We'll let you know as soon as we have more information. As they walked toward the door, Thomas called out, When can we know who this person is? When can we know if our children are safe? Detective Martinez paused and turned back. We're working on it. But I want to be honest with you. Whoever this person is, they went to significant lengths to remain hidden. That suggests planning, deliberation. This wasn't random. This was targeted. After the detectives left, Sarah and Thomas stood in their living room in stunned silence. The house that had always felt like a sanctuary now felt like a cage. Every shadow seemed sinister. Every sound seemed threatening. We have to move, Sarah said finally, her voice hollow. We can't stay here. We can't raise our children in a house where someone was watching them. Thomas pulled her close, and she could feel him trembling. I know. But first, we need to understand what happened. We need to know who did this. And in the police station across town, Detective Chen was reviewing the journal entries found in the hidden attic room, her expression growing darker with each page she read. Because the entries didn't just describe observations of the Morrison family. They contained something far more disturbing, a plan. A detailed, methodical plan that, if it had come to fruition, would have changed the Morrison family's lives forever. Detective Sarah Chen sat in the dimly lit interrogation room of the police station, the leather-bound journal spread out before her on the metal table. The pages were worn, some of them creased and stained, the handwriting ranging from neat and controlled to frantic and erratic. It was the kind of document that told a story not just through words, but through the physical evidence of a deteriorating mental state. She'd been reading for 3 hours straight, and with each entry, her sense of dread had deepened. She'd worked homicide for 18 years. She'd seen the worst that humanity had to offer. But something about this journal, about the meticulous documentation of obsession, made her skin crawl in a way that even violent crime scenes didn't. Detective Martinez entered the room with 2 cups of coffee, setting one down in front of Chen without a word. He'd been her partner for 12 years, and he knew her well enough to recognize when she needed caffeine and when she needed silence. "What have we got?" he asked finally, settling into the chair across from her. Chen took a long sip of coffee before responding. The entries start 8 months ago in April. The writer, and I'm using writer loosely, because this person's mental state deteriorates significantly as the entries progress. First mentions the Morrison family by name on April 15th. She flipped to a marked page and began to read aloud. "Found them today. The perfect family. Perfect house. Perfect opportunity. They don't know I'm watching, but I can see them through the windows. The mother is beautiful. The father is strong. But the children are exactly what I've been looking for. Innocent, trusting, unaware of the dangers that lurk in the world. I can protect them. I can save them. I can show them a better way. They just don't know it yet." Martinez leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenching. "This is a predator's manifesto." "It gets worse," Chen said grimly. She turned to another page, dated May 3rd. "I've been watching the house for 3 weeks now. The routine is predictable. Father leaves at 7:45 a.m., returns at 5:30 p.m. Mother takes the older child to school at 8:15 a.m., returns home by 9 a.m. The younger child stays home with a nanny on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but mostly the mother is there. The dog is a problem. It barks when I'm near. I'll need to address that. Perhaps the propane heater will serve dual purposes. The carbon monoxide will make them all sleepy, compliant. Perfect." "Jesus Christ," Martinez muttered. This person was planning to incapacitate the entire family. "Keep reading," Chen said, her voice heavy. She turned to another entry, dated June 12th. "I've successfully installed the heater. It took 3 nights, carefully entering through the roof access panel when the family was asleep. They're so trusting, so oblivious. The heater is positioned perfectly. When I activate it, the carbon monoxide will seep down into the main living areas. They'll become drowsy, confused. The mother will think it's stress. The father will think it's the heat. And by the time anyone suspects anything, I'll have already taken the children. They'll be safe with me, away from this corrupt world, away from the influences that will destroy them. I am their savior. I am their destiny." Martinez stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We need to find this person, now, before they try again." "There's more," Chen said quietly. She flipped to a more recent entry, dated just 2 weeks ago. "The dog knows. It senses my presence. It's becoming a problem. But I can work with this. I'll let the dog lead them to discover the heater. Let them think it's just a mechanical failure. Let them feel safe again. And then, when their guard is down, when they think the danger has passed, I'll make my move. The mother will be vulnerable. The children will be unprotected. And I will finally fulfill my purpose." Chen looked up from the journal, her eyes meeting Martinez's. This person wasn't just planning to abduct the children. They were planning to do something to the parents first. Something permanent. "Do we have any leads on who this person is?" Martinez asked. though he already knew the answer. "Nothing yet," Chen replied, frustration evident in her voice. "No fingerprints in the system. The handwriting doesn't match any known offenders. We're running DNA from items found in the hidden room, but those results will take time. We've also put out an alert to all local law enforcement. If this person is still in the area, we'll find them." "And if they're not in the area?" Martinez asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Chen didn't answer. They both knew what that meant. It meant the person was still out there, still planning, still obsessing over the Morrison family, still waiting for another opportunity. Meanwhile, back at Michael's house, Sarah was sitting in the kitchen with Patricia, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Emma and David, who were playing with Kevin in the living room. Max lay at Sarah's feet, his head resting on her shoe, as if he was afraid to let her out of his sight. Thomas was on the phone with their insurance company, discussing what would happen to their house, whether they could claim the cost of repairs and remediation. But Sarah knew that no amount of money would make her feel safe in that house again. The walls had been violated. The sanctuary had been breached. "You should talk to someone," Patricia said gently, setting a cup of tea in front of Sarah. "A therapist. What you've been through. What your family has been through. That's traumatic." Sarah nodded numbly. She knew Patricia was right. But how could she possibly explain this to a therapist? How could she put into words the violation she felt? The knowledge that a stranger had been watching her children sleep, that someone had been planning something unspeakable. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I'm still here. I'm still watching. The dogs saved you this time, but I'm patient. I can wait. I will have them." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Her hands began to shake. She showed the message to Patricia, who immediately called Thomas. Within minutes, they were calling Detective Chen. Within an hour, they were back at the police station, showing the detectives the message, their fear escalating to a new level. "This is a direct threat," Detective Chen said, her expression grim as she examined the phone. "We're going to trace this number immediately. In the meantime, I'm assigning officers to your location. You're not to be alone. Not for a moment." "Who is this person?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "What do they want from us?" "We don't know yet," Detective Martinez replied. "But we're going to find them, I promise you that." But as he said the words, he exchanged a glance with Detective Chen that Sarah didn't miss. It was a glance that said, "We hope we find them, before they find you." That night, Sarah lay awake in the guest room at Michael's house, listening to the sounds of the unfamiliar space. Every creak of the floorboards made her tense. Every shadow seemed to contain a threat. Max, sensing her anxiety, refused to leave her side, his eyes open and alert, his body tense and ready. She thought about the journal entries, about the meticulous planning, about the person who'd spent 8 months watching her family, documenting their routines, planning their destruction. And she realized with a sickening clarity that they'd come so close. If Max hadn't started howling, if she hadn't called the fire department, if Captain Rodriguez hadn't discovered the hidden room, her children would be gone, and she and Thomas would be dead. The text message haunted her. "I'm still here. I'm still watching." Somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond the walls of Michael's house, someone was thinking about her family. Someone was planning. Someone was waiting. And Sarah Morrison understood with absolute certainty that this nightmare was far from over. It was only just beginning. The question was no longer whether the Morrison family would survive. The question was whether they would ever feel safe again, and whether the person who'd been hiding in their attic would succeed in completing what they'd started. The police station's command center had transformed into a war room. Detective Chen stood before a large whiteboard covered with photographs, timelines, and notes. The image of the Morrison house was pinned at the center, with red string connecting various pieces of evidence like a spider's web of investigation. 3 days had passed since the threatening text message. 3 days of intensive police work, psychological profiling, and desperate attempts to trace the sender's identity. The text had come from a burner phone purchased at a convenience store on the opposite side of town, paid for in cash, with no surveillance footage that could identify the buyer. We've expanded the investigation beyond just the Morrison case, Detective Martinez explained to his partner as they reviewed the latest findings. We've cross-referenced missing persons reports from the past 2 years, looked for any similar cases involving hidden rooms or obsessive surveillance. So far, nothing matches perfectly, but we did find something interesting. He pulled up a file on his computer. 18 months ago, a family in the neighboring county reported suspicious activity. Sounds in their attic, items missing from their garage. They called it in, we investigated, found nothing. The case went cold. But given what we know now, I'm wondering if this is our person's first attempt, a trial run. Chen leaned closer to the screen, studying the details. Did they have children? 2, Martinez confirmed, ages 7 and 9. The mother reported that the daughter had been having nightmares, claiming there was someone in the house. The father thought she was just being imaginative. They moved out of the house 6 months later, unrelated to the investigation. Sold it to a young couple. We need to contact them, Chen said immediately. Find out if they ever experienced anything else unusual. And we need to check if there were any similar incidents at their new residence. As Martinez made the calls, Chen turned her attention back to the journal. She'd been reading and rereading the entries, trying to construct a psychological profile of the person who'd written them. The handwriting analysis had revealed signs of obsessive-compulsive disorder, possible schizophrenia, and what the psychologist had termed erotomania with violent ideation. An obsessive belief that one is loved by another person, combined with violent fantasies. But what struck Chen most was the evolution of the entries. The early ones from April and May were almost romantic in their obsession. The writer described the Morrison family with something approaching reverence. But as the months progressed, the tone shifted. The entries became darker, more paranoid. By August, the writer was expressing anger at the Morrisons for not understanding, for resisting the gift of being saved. The most recent entries from the past month were almost incoherent. Fragments of sentences, drawings that looked like maps of the house, lists of items with cryptic labels, tools, supplies, contingencies. And then, on September 15th, the final entry before the hidden room was discovered. Tomorrow is the day. I've prepared everything. The heater will activate at midnight. By dawn, they'll be drowsy and confused. The children will be easy to take. The parents will be too weak to resist. I am ready. I am finally ready to save them from this world of corruption and pain. By this time tomorrow, they will be mine. The family will be complete. The prophecy will be fulfilled. We need to understand what triggered the decision to act now, Chen said aloud, though she was mostly thinking out loud. What changed? Why did the planning phase end and the action phase begin on September 15th? Martinez hung up the phone. The family from the neighboring county confirmed they experienced similar incidents. Sounds in the attic, missing items. They also mentioned that their daughter reported seeing a face at her window one night. They thought she was dreaming, but now they're terrified it was real. Did they move because of the incidents? Chen asked. No, they moved for a job transfer. The father got a promotion in another state. They left in March of last year. So if this is the same person, they moved on to the Morrison family shortly after. Chen's mind was racing. The pattern was becoming clearer. This wasn't a one-time offender. This was a serial predator who'd been actively hunting families with children for at least 18 months, possibly longer. We need to go public, she said decisively. We need to release information about this person to the media. Someone out there knows something. Someone has seen something. We need to cast a wide net. That evening, Detective Chen held a press conference in front of the police station. News vans from 3 different local stations were parked along the street, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. Reporters crowded around with microphones and cameras, eager to get the story that would lead the evening news. On September 15th, we discovered evidence of a serious crime at a residence in our community. Chen began, her voice steady and professional. An individual has been conducting unauthorized surveillance of a family, specifically targeting their children. This individual constructed a hidden living space in the family's attic and was preparing to commit a violent crime. The reporters erupted with questions, but Chen continued. We are seeking information about a person who may have been observed in the area of Maple Street between April and September of this year. This person would likely be male, based on physical evidence found at the scene. He may have been observed carrying construction materials, conducting surveillance, or acting suspiciously around residential properties. She displayed a composite sketch, a drawing created by a forensic artist based on descriptions found in the journal and physical evidence like shoe size and estimated height. The face was unremarkable, almost generic. Brown hair, average features, the kind of person you might pass on the street without a second glance. If anyone has information about this individual, we urge you to contact the police department immediately. This is an extremely dangerous person who poses an immediate threat to families in our community. The press conference lasted 20 minutes. By the time it was over, the story was already spreading across social media, news websites, and television broadcasts. The composite sketch was being shared thousands of times per hour. The Morrison family's address, despite Chen's efforts to keep it private, was being discussed in online forums and comment sections. At Michael's house, Sarah watched the press conference on television, her stomach churning with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that the police were taking the threat seriously. Horror that her family's trauma was now public knowledge, being discussed by strangers across the internet. Her phone began to ring almost immediately. Friends calling to express concern, family members demanding more information, news outlets requesting interviews. Sarah turned off her phone and handed it to Patricia. I can't, she said simply. I can't talk to anyone right now. Thomas was in the other room with Emma and David, trying to shield them from the news coverage. But Emma, at 14, was old enough to understand what was happening. She'd already seen the composite sketch online, already read some of the comments. The fear in her eyes had transformed into something harder, a kind of angry determination mixed with trauma. We need to do something, Emma said when Sarah found her in the bedroom. We can't just hide here and wait for them to catch this person. What if they don't? What if they're out there right now, planning something else? The police are handling it, Sarah tried to reassure her. But even as she said the words, she didn't believe them. The police were doing their best, but this person had managed to hide in their attic for 8 months without being detected. What was to stop them from hiding somewhere else? What was to stop them from trying again? Across town, in a small apartment on the east side of the city, A man sat in front of a computer screen, watching the press conference over and over again. His hands were shaking. His face, which bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketch, but with subtle differences that made him impossible to identify with certainty, was flushed with anger and humiliation. They'd found him. They'd discovered his sanctuary. They'd violated his sacred space and turned his beautiful plan into a police investigation. But they didn't know who he was. The sketch was close, but not close enough. And he was careful. He'd worn gloves in the attic. He'd been meticulous about leaving no DNA evidence. The journal was in his handwriting, yes, but handwriting analysis was an imprecise science. They had nothing concrete. What they did have was his burner phone number. But he'd already destroyed that phone, smashed it into pieces, and scattered them across the city. And the convenience store where he'd purchased it had poor quality surveillance footage. The image was too grainy to identify him with certainty. He opened a new burner phone, the third one he'd purchased in the past 3 days, and composed a new message. He typed carefully, deliberately. "You think you've stopped me. You think you've won, but you've only delayed the inevitable. I am patient. I am invisible. I am everywhere and nowhere. The children will be mine. The family will be mine. This is not over. This is only the beginning." He sent the message to the Morrison family's phone number, then destroyed this burner phone as well. The game had changed. The police were now actively hunting him. But he had advantages they didn't understand. He had patience. He had obsession. He had a clarity of purpose that civilians could never comprehend. And most importantly, he had already selected his next target. Detective Chen was in her office when the second threatening message came through. She read it once, then twice, her jaw clenching with frustration and anger. "He's escalating," she said to Martinez, who was standing in the doorway with a fresh cup of coffee. "The messages are becoming more grandiose, more delusional. He's positioning himself as unstoppable, inevitable. This is a classic pattern of a predator who feels cornered but still believes he's in control." "What does that mean for the Morrison family?" Martinez asked. "It means he's not going to stop," Chen replied grimly. "It means he's already planning his next move. And it means we need to find him before he acts again." She pulled up the database of sex offenders and violent criminals in the region. Hundreds of faces stared back at her from the screen. Hundreds of possibilities. Thousands of dead ends. Somewhere in this city, a predator was planning. A hunter was preparing. And Detective Sarah Chen was running out of time to stop him. But what neither Chen nor the Morrison family knew was that the person they were hunting had already moved beyond his obsession with their family. He'd already selected a new target, a new family, a new set of children to save from the corrupted world. And this time, he wasn't going to make the same mistakes. This time, he was going to be perfect.